welcome Eddie Muller.
Okay, I came of age watching movies in the 1970s, right? Born in 1958, I really became a cinema addict in the 1970s. What's so exciting about the show that you were about to see is that I saw so many great movies in the movie theater at that time. The work of the guy that we are celebrating today is the first thing you see in all those great movies from the 1970s. So we're going to start the show off by just giving you a sample of this man's work. So please, let's roll.
Oh yeah, exactly. Please. Oh wow. Wonderful.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so here's the deal. When I grew up, Dan, thank you for being here. I so appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Before I really got into films, I wanted to be an illustrator, and I was a graphic designer, and I had such a fascination with posters and typography. I have a massive poster collection and all this stuff. And I so loved Dan Perri's work, and it was because you know, I'm one of those guys who looks at the titles like, who did the titles on this, right? And at the crawl at the end, there would always be, you know, titles by Dan Perri. And I'd say, all right, that guy's good. So imagine how great it felt when one day I get a call from this guy, and he asks me if I would be interested in writing the foreword to a book he's doing about his career. So that's how we connected. So Dan, just give us a little. How did you get into this? And you really are an Angelino. You are from here.
No, I'm from New York, but I lived there in my early years.
Your grandfather was an Angelino. I was trying to set up that he had a haberdashery right over
Yeah,
here.
one of my grandfathers had a tailor shop. Both my grandfathers were tailors. And my father's father had a tailor shop here in Hollywood, on Yucca, right off of Vine Street. And he made a lot of suits for Eddie Fisher, Bob Hope, and a lot of big-time Hollywood producers. So I kind of got a sense of all that when I was a kid. And then I went to school here locally, and I was fortunate to have as my teacher in high school a woman who had been an art director on Madison Avenue in the 60s. So she knew a whole about the advertising scene, and at that time I wanted to be an agency art director. So she cultivated my interest and my talent, and I went on to go to Art Center College of Design after that. But around that time I started painting signs because of falling in love with letters and graphics and type. And from there I learned that I could make my designs move because there was this little segment of filmmaking called titles. So I pursued that, worked with a couple of title designers who were prominent at the time, and then went out for my own with a friend from high school who we studied together with this woman in high school. And we did a lot of low-budget films and TV shows for David Walter and people like that. And then he left, and I went out on my own. I just got The Exorcist just as we broke up, and from there it's just been a wild ride.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's do this. Let's give you. You already teased the first one, so now it's not going to be a surprise to the audience. But let's take a look. We're going to show you some examples of Dan's work here. We're not going to tell you what the films are before, so the titles will come up just like you're in the movie theater. Here you go. Let's start with the first clip. Now, seems kind of simple, right? But tell us all that goes into because this is, I guarantee you that if you're a fan of typography, when you see that typeface, you think of The Exorcist, even if it doesn't say The Exorcist. So tell us how this came about.
Okay, well first the type style is called Vice Initials #2. I found it was the style that was on the original book when it was first released, way before it became a film. So I adapted that style, and then I had to deal with the myriad of titles that were on the end credits, and to design every one of them in a delicate, interesting way. It was kind of confronted that first. But after, while I was designing the titles, I was working with Billy Friedkin, and he came to me one day and said, the first shot of the film, I've got this shot that I made in northern Iraq, and I wanted a sunrise, but I never shot a sunrise. So he asked what I could do with that. So I suggested that we do a very, very slow fade in of that shot of the sun under the night sky, and then very gradually it became color. And he loved the idea, so I then had to take it to Pacific Title, who was doing all the effects, and just really hammer them to do this hand-built 30-second dissolve. But when it came out, Billy loved it and used it for the first shot. That's what I showed him.
Was he difficult to work with? Because Friedkin has a reputation as quite a perfectionist.
Yes, well, everyone on the show had said that he was difficult to work with from their experience working with him. But every time I met with him, he was so gracious and kind and cultivated my ideas. And sometimes I go up to see him on the mixing stage, and he'd be yelling at somebody when I got there, but then he said, "Go with me." One day I left, and the assistant editor came running back. He said, "He wants to talk to you again." He said, "I'm so glad when you come because he's really nice to us for a few days." But later, doing his last film, before he passed away last year, we had great fun recalling the experiences of working with him 40 years ago.
Did you do other films of his?
I did the next one, Sorcerer, and then he did a number of them without me, and then his last one, gee, I forget what it was called, the one about the court.
The Cane Mutiny.
Yeah. So I did that with, he wrote me an email and asked me, would you please consider doing my titles for this movie? And that was very unlike the Billy Friedkin I knew from the reputation.
And I think it's important to point out that when Dan started doing this and making his name in the business, none of this stuff was done in a computer.
Yeah.
I mean, Dan was doing all this stuff. Well,
By hand.
You can explain as we,
I had a favorite typesetter, and he would set all my type on film. We had film strips of the fonts, And then I would have to take it and build it, and construct it, lay it out, and prepare the titles for the camera, which you had to know how the camera worked. That was shoot the title elements and then composite them with a background or whatever. So there was a lot of technical aspects that I had to learn and know and use them most effectively as possible. When I first started in the business, I learned how expensive it was to shoot anything on film.
Yes.
And when I get a budget, I had to monitor it very closely to make sure I had some profit left, after shooting all the things that had to be done. And oftentimes my ideas were unusual and unique, and that's why they wanted me on these films. But the unknown was, could I produce this within the budget and preserve a profit?
So that's very interesting. So what you're saying is they would give you a budget to create the titles,
Right.
and the more resourcefully you could produce them, the more profit you were making.
That's right.
Oh,
And you never
interesting.
cut.
I know that feeling very well.
Yes.
No, I mean, I've done, the first books that I produced, I actually got paid more to design the book than I got paid to write the book. So if you could be resourceful, it was extra money. You're saving money in that budget that goes into the pocket.
Yeah,
So-
you had to get creative at the same time, preserve the concept, deliver what you offered. Oftentimes I was able to deliver more than I offered. So that,
We'll get into one of those stories because I'm saving it. Okay, so we're going to watch another clip now that's a totally different thing from William Friedkin's The Exorcist, just to show you that Dan Perri has a tremendous sense of humor as well as a sense of dread that you get from The Exorcist. So let's roll our next clip.
Now, after years in the making, Nashville, presents Hell 24 of your very favorite stars. David Arkin, with Barbara Baxter, Dan Perri, in Nashville, and the Baxter performances of Perry Wax, Ronnie Ridley, Timothy Brown in Nashville, Jeremy Cameron, Robert O'Shea in Nashville, and the exciting appearances of Kevin Duvall, Robert Garcia, and Henry Gibson in Nashville, and the fantastic Stuntman, Jim Goldblum, Barbara Harris in Nashville, not to mention the terrific David Hillard, Michael Murphy, Alan Nichols in Nashville, and the all-time great Dave Peter, Steve Hayes, Mark Redford in Nashville, plus Peter Connell, Thomas, Whitwell, and Peter in Nashville. He's a personal earmark from one of the magnificent stars in the Nashville stereophonic sound, and to look at you right before your very eyes without commercial interruption.
Fellow taxpayers and stockholders and developers, on the first Tuesday in November, we have to make some vital decisions about our name.
Okay. Now, I think there are probably some young people in the audience who don't get the gag. But explain what this was all about. This is like 1975, and if you
Yes.
watched television in 1975, you saw these.
Now, when I first viewed the film with Bob Altman, I saw these elegant, beautiful designs, and I showed him half a dozen or so of these different designs for the title. And he hated them. He said, this beautiful work. He said, but this is nowhere near what the film needs. He said, look at the film again. He said, it's raunchy, it's loud, it's gross and crude, and that's the things I'm looking for. So I viewed it again, and at the same time, I was watching a lot of late night television, and here in LA, on all of the independent TV stations, there were these commercials advertising these record albums that were packed with rock and roll or country or whatever the genre.
K-Tel.
Yeah, these really junky commercials on late at night that were just screaming at you, trying to sell you these record albums. And somehow I thought they were perfect for selling movies. So I made it exactly 60 seconds, just the way the commercials were on television. And a lot of them were narrated by Johnny Grant. So I found him, and I wrote a script that he could read and shout it, so I could cut to it. And out of it came this cacophony of crazy moments. And it was based on a painting that Bob had somebody do that had all 24 of the actors in this painting. So I zoomed in and whip painted each one of them as the narration would introduce them by name. And then the idea of the title rolling up and down and flashing on, coming on out of sync with the words naturally. It all had to be so amateurish and feel authentic to the young
Perfect.
genres.
And also very practical, because it's a gag, but it's also getting an entire cast in very short amount of time. You run through there and they all get their moment and everything, but it's like insanely fast and I love that, because you're doing them a great favor by getting into it quickly. And then, was that your idea to do the transition to the film itself by just
Yes,
using
to the
that?
shot of the
Yeah.
door coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, that is quite brilliant.
It was a logical extension of it for me.
And I just want to digress for a moment before we go to the next clip to say, one of your title sequences that is a personal favorite of mine is for another Robert Altman film, California Split. With, if you've seen this, with Elliot Gould and George Siegel. It's about gambling, it's about, poker parlors and going to the track and everything. And Dan devised a sequence for that is so great, because people who don't understand gambling after the title sequence.
Yes.
Because they walk through the poker parlor with a video playing of how the game works, and then explain what you did for the titles themselves.
Well, I based it on the cards, the four suits of clubs and diamonds and so on. And so I had each of those put on the screen one at a time, and then Bob had the idea to put the sound of laying a card down and then flipping the deck.
Right.
And as you hear the deck flipping, then the title comes on, California Split, and it splits open, and it's red and blue through the center. And then I devised that for all the other titles that played over that sequence as well.
Yeah, so it's this beautifully graphically expressive thing that gives all the expository information, introduces all the important characters in the film, and it's like, I don't know, how long is that sequence?
A couple of minutes at most.
A couple of minutes at most, and it's like, you are such a help to the filmmakers in getting people into the movie. So what's your philosophy of doing a title sequence?
Well, I'm always in service to the film, what I feel the film needs, and I have no interest in doing something that's terrific or good looking or whatever if it's not what the film needs. I don't have any ego for that. It's always what the film needs. So I'm driven by my own emotions after seeing the film and just listening to myself about how I feel about it. And ideas always come to me, fortunately. So I then run with them. I often have too many ideas, so I have to whittle them down and bring the best of them to the director. Sometimes I'll have one in my back pocket just in case, but unfortunately, pretty much like what I've done over the years.
Well, the next clip we're going to show you is the one that made me aware of Dan Perri, because this was a film that was very, very important in my life at the time I saw it, and it is, I think, one of the most evocative and effective title sequences I've ever seen in a movie. Let's run this one. But I think this title sequence is the absolute epitome of what a great title sequence is, because every element is in play. The photography, the typography, of course, Bernard Herrmann's amazing score for the film. So just explain to me how this all, and your choices, how these choices got made.
Okay, well, it came to me after viewing 200,000 feet of second unit. Marshall Lucas and I viewed, and then out of it, we cut the sequence over about 2 weeks in the order of the shots. And then once that was established, I took it into optical and started playing with the effects. The first thing I knew I had to do was to shoot all the images from color print rather than from an interpositive. And IP is designed to reproduce the image as cleanly, as sharply as possible. So if you're shooting a daytime shot with clouds and buildings and so on, the IP would reproduce it to look exactly like it with a little bit more grain. But shooting from a color print, you get the saturation of all the colors. So I wanted those black blacks and red reds and yellow yellows and so on. So I shot the entire sequence from a color print, including the title, the Columbia logo, with it as well. So then I began to experiment with effects to bring the most texture and feeling of this underbelly of New York that this film was set in as much as possible. There's a shot from POV through the windshield of Travis Bickle that it looks like it's streaking and there's rain on the windshield. Well, I found at the time, these optical guys had developed this effect called slit scan, and it involved shooting a shot and shooting it over and over and over and slipping it one frame every time you exposed it. So it had that kind of a trailing effect. Mm-hmm. And it was perfect for the shot because it was raining and there were slick streets and all. It really enhanced that moment a lot. And then I slowed things down, double frame, and things like that. And then the titles that occurred before that split scan shot, I wanted the titles to be affected by the background. So I didn't carry a mat, which would have protected the titles. So instead I got this glow, but it was undulation that was changing all the time. It was contaminated by the background. So they weren't clean and pure. They were affected by the world that should take place in.
And it's interesting because, like The Exorcist, the typeface that you use in Taxi Driver is so distinctive that, again, it's like when you see that typeface now, I relate it directly to Taxi Driver. Like that's Taxi Driver lettering. And what was the origin of the typeface?
I wanted the type of the signs all over the city. So I went to the traffic department of the city of New York and I talked them into telling me what the type style was that they used on all those signs. I was able to get the font, and I said all the titles, they had to be very tight and very vertical. And I said all of it in this city type style, including the end credits. And it all had to be up high like the signs were on the street and packed in the corner. So it reflected the tension and the uniqueness of the world of Travis Bickle.
And how about when the taxi, how was that done when the taxi drifts by and then it reveals the title of the movie?
Well,
easily done in a computer now. Yeah. This was 1974.
Yeah. Well, we had to track the edge of the taxi every frame that it was revealing the title. It's called rotoscoping, and it involved just projecting down each frame and tracing it with a pencil and then cutting it out and making this matte, this burning matte out of it, which took hours and hours. But the effect was worthwhile.
And when did you come up with the idea to make the typeface like have that neon glow? Because that sells it. That's the whole thing.
Well, yeah, the yellow, the ochre was really part of the landscape, the color of the world there in the back of lights and so on, lights of the taxi, and then the glow was obvious to me. And then the contamination came out of not allowing the title to be protected by a mat, so it would just be affected by the smoke and the glow of the shot that it was over.
And also the thing about this that I love is it sets up the movie perfectly, because it's a surprise when it cuts to Travis's face, right? Because you're not expecting that. And then so explain to me how that was done, because then there's a reverse angle shot of what Travis is looking at, and you see it. And so it sets the audience up for you're about to experience a movie entirely from within the mind of this character. This is his view of the world that you're about to see.
Right, and then after that, we've got to bring the audience back to reality. So the shot where he comes into the taxi company there and talks to the guy at the desk, I slowly dissolved from the color print to the inner positive of that shot. So imperceptibly, suddenly you're in reality. And then the guy talks to him and we're in.
And this was the first film that you did for Scorsese?
Yes, it was. He wanted me to do Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. That was the first film, the film before this one. And he went to Rudy Fair, who was an editor. He was the head of post-production at Columbia. He cut a lot of Hitchcock films about big films and premiere. And he was running post-production. And Marty came to him and said, I'd like this new guy, Dan Perri, to the title. And Rudy said, who the hell is he? No, you can't have that. Because I wasn't known at that time.
Yeah.
So Marty promised me I'd do the next one, which was Taxi Driver.
And how many films in all did you do with Scorsese?
10 films with Marty.
Wow.
Now I finally finished the sequence, and by that time, Marty was on the stage doing the final mix. He asked me to bring it over to the stage, so I had done that many times on films. By the time I finished what I was doing, they were way ahead of me finishing the film. So I brought it in, and they had the first reel up on the screen. They were doing the sound for it, and Marty motioned me to go up and bring the film up to the projection booth. So I went upstairs and I cut it in, and when I came down, the Columbia logo had just come on the screen. They were just starting to view it. So we watched it all together for the first time with music, and I'd not seen it with music before that. And as soon as it was over, they shut down the projection, and the lights came up, and Marty was like racing toward me across the room. And he was just, delighted at how it looked and how happy he was with it. So he clasped my hand and praised it and so on. And then he said, say hello to Bernard Herrmann. So I looked to my right, and there was this little tiny natty man standing there. And he congratulated me on the work, and I then congratulated him on the wonderful music. And we had a moment then. And then about 2 weeks later, Marty called me and said, we have to do a tribute title to him, who he had just died a couple of days before.
That was Bernard Herrmann's final film score.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So you did that without hearing the music?
Yes.
That's incredible, because they're inseparable. I can't even imagine. Wow.
I had to work with the music editor afterward to tighten it and really make it work. But very little had to be done. Now, I know I was shooting tests and I was showing Marty pieces, but I would bring things over and show him, and then I'd take it away. So he had nothing to show to Bernard Herrmann either of my images. Yet, magically it came together. It couldn't have been any better.
No, it could. It's a masterpiece. Okay, now, next clip is going to be very, very short. It's just to take us down a detour to another aspect of Dan's career. But let's just run this and then we'll get into it. That was it. Okay, so tell us about this. How did you get hooked up with Nightmare on Elm Street?
Well, I met Wes Craven, who directed part 3. Actually, he might have directed the first one.
I think he directed the first one.
And then he directed another, that's Chuck Russell, who did the third one. But Chuck really liked me, and I designed a logo that became the logo for the whole series. Then on the second one, they wanted me to direct the second unit, but that fell through so far that they promised me the third one. So I directed the whole second unit, which was about 40% of the movie by the time it came out. And I worked with all the principals, but I wasn't allowed to direct anything with dialogue, only the images. But in fact, I wasn't even allowed to work with all the principals, but I did anyway. We shot 16-hour days for about 6 weeks. It was really fun and hard work, but had lots of innovative things. All the crew were first-timers, and they later became very well known for their costumes or their makeup and effects and so on. So we were all learning together and working in vacuum of this film, and no one knew what they had, but it turned out to be quite an interesting thing. And then I did part 4 as well. But working with the New Line Cinema people was quite an experience.
Uh-oh, maybe I better not go there, but I'm going to turn this slightly in a different direction because, that's the unmistakable Nightmare on Elm Street, the design of Nightmare on that. But there's another film that you did that is so utterly recognizable to everyone, and I want you to tell this story because it shows how important that visual identifier is to a film, and that would be Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So just tell us about your history with this.
Okay, well, the producers of Close Encounters, Michael and Julia Phillips, had produced Taxi Driver. So when they got this gig with Steven Spielberg, who was known as Steve at that time, they invited me to come in and meet Steve, and they hadn't even shot the film at that point. In fact, they were rewriting, and Paul Schrader's script became Steven Spielberg's script. And so I worked off of the original Schrader script, but the first thing that Steven wanted me to do, which was very wise of him and unknown at that time, was to do a logo before the film was even made. Usually when as they're cutting and starting to promote the film, the logo will come at that point. So I did this logo, which had these kind of striations, lines in the film that were very reminiscent of space and science fiction and so on. And then they asked me to do the ad campaign, the whole ad campaign. And at that point I learned from the head of the advertising department who invited me to come over and talk about it, that I learned later that I was going to do the campaign because Stephen had dictated it. And that day in his office they had like 6 feet of these big, full one-sheet posters that were lined up from every major and minor design studio in New York and LA that they'd hired by Columbia to present the ad campaign. Spielberg had rejected all of them. So he then told advertising that I would do the ad campaign, but I didn't know that. So that day, I come in and he's talking about it, and he showed me all this work. There's a lot of nice work there. But he said, so we're interested in doing the title of the ad campaign. I said, sure. So he started walking around me as if he was interrogating me. He said, well, how much you want? And I hadn't thought about it, but the $5,000 came into my head.
It was a different time.
I was about to say that, and he said, all right, look, I'll just give you $20,000 and that'll be it. So by not opening my mouth, I made $15,000. Similar to $50,000 now, which is what they think.
Yeah, I still think he got underpaid.
So I did the whole campaign, designed what became known as the Road in the Glow that was shot.
Road in the Glow.
And I had my retoucher create the glow and so on from the original shot from the film, and then produced it all. The one-sheet poster, the billboard, the game box, the 2 different novels.
It was a stencil on all the crates and everything they shipped for the film, right?
Yes.
That logo stenciled on it.
Made stickers and put it on all the boxes, the counter boxes and so on, and stationery and whatnot, and it was all to identify the film, and it became something that the crew and the cast could get behind and feel like they belonged to this thing that existed, rather than just a script and a description. So that worked very well, and that I learned from it to do a logo ahead of time whenever the director thought that was a good idea.
Okay, now we're going to show you something, another really brief one, but it's setting up something that's kind of jaw-dropping to me. So we're going back to Scorsese territory now, I think. That's it. But here's why that is included and what's so amazing.
Yeah, that's the whole main title.
Yeah.
Originally, I had suggested to Marty that we do a sequence based on sculptures that we see in the film. The high deco from the 20s, 30s, 40s. They shot a lot of footage in the Egyptian theater and other theaters where there's incredible sculptures in gold and silver and bronze and so on. So I said, why don't we do these sculptures based upon the still photos from the film that the production still photographer had done. So I went through like thousands and thousands of shots and picked out a dozen or so of them. And I even did sculptures in the computer, and I had the logo done as a sculpture as well, how it would look when my artist sculpture would create this whole sequence. And I was going to lay on the floor and film it, and move across it and so on. But at that time, Marty was having big problems with the Weinstein brothers, and they had some big fights, and things got delayed to where the Bond company had to step in and take the film away from them. And they cut the budgets, like my budget was $120,000, I think, and they cut it to $20,000. So I wasn't able to do the sculptures, and finally I produced that logo that you just saw digitally, which worked pretty well, but it wasn't nearly as good as if it had been done, sculpted by hand and filmed with a live camera. But it still worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I think so. That was a good one. So, and then we got one more that's kind of intriguing, and then let's just show. This is going to be a bit of a longer clip, and it's the end of the film instead of the beginning of the film in this case. But it involves some very interesting choices with typography and things. So let's roll our last clip here.
Was our great city. But for those of us what lived and died in them furious days, it was like everything we knew was mightily swept away. And no matter what they did to build this city up again, for the rest of time, it would be like no one even knew he was ever here.
Interesting choices. So what was the decision with this, what am I,
Letters.
Yeah, from old typography, you know, in newspapers, the block letterpress.
The film took place in the 1860s, I think it was. So I went out to different type shops that had been around for a long time, and I went through all their wood type. At the time, around the turn of the century, that's all they had was wood type, and started making it out of metal. So I chose these letters, and they're actual real pieces of wood block that were used in printing for years and years for different newspapers and so on. So I constructed this, built it, and then I photographed it with at the time, a 5 megapixel camera, which was the top of the line. 89, whenever this was done. And I then took that and photographed it and created the moves and the zooms and so on. And I wanted it to be so gigantic on the screen. And Marty loved the idea of that, that would just almost go off the screen as big as it was, because the film is so muscular and tough. I shot it that way first, but then I get a call from the production office saying we've come across these old contracts with Marty and I forget the name of the producer, but originally we'd done an ad 10 years before with these producers that Marty wanted to make the film then, but then things got delayed and finally, but those contracts from 10 years before still applied, and now these producers have to have their name at 75% of the main title. So if I was going to use this gigantic title, I had to make their names 75% of it. It would have diminished the muscularity, the power of what I was trying to accomplish. But then I got the idea, well, all these letters are different sizes, so I measured each of them and I averaged the size. 100%, and I made them 75% of that size.
That's great. I did not know that, because I was thinking when I did the rehearsal for this, like, why did Dan include this one? And now I know. Now I know. Genius. That was brilliant. But also very interesting because that's a challenge. People who do typography, putting letters on letters on a screen is a challenge, to not just make it a mess, So how did you choose that other typeface for the actual credits as opposed to this title face here?
Well, because these are actually dimensional, they have depth to them. That was in one plane, and then the titles were over that. But I wanted them to live separately on its own plane, so I created a drop shadow for them, as if light was casting a shadow on those wooden letters. And though I wanted them to be close to the same color, so an outline and a drop shadow were the ways to separate that and still allow them to live and deliver the information that had been done.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes to go, and I'm hoping that there's some of you who have questions and you can avail yourself of Dan's knowledge and expertise.
Thanks so much for being here today. You mentioned music a little bit earlier. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process, whether it helps you to have music beforehand, whether it's a hindrance or doesn't matter, either way. Thanks.
Yes, working with music beforehand is a great help. To collaborate with the composer, I find, and they find that they do the best work by the composer responding to my thoughts and ideas and things I might show him, and conversely, anything, melodies he's got going or notes with certain instruments or whatever, if he can share that with me, and then we collaborate on that, and then we go our separate ways and come back with a product that should be married by those notions, and oftentimes it really works well because of the collaboration that we can have. There have been times that, like on Taxi Driver, where it wasn't able to work to the music. So you just create what you can from your own emotions, from seeing the film, working with the director, and thoughts and notions from that. And other times, I might do a sequence that has music, but then for one reason or another, the music is thrown out. So the new composer has to do something to what I've done already, but doesn't have the opportunity to collaborate with me. But the best opportunity is when you're working closely with the composer, you can find the best solution that way.
Okay. Yes.
The early 70s were famous, we had golden era for groundbreaking cinema. Would you say that allowed you to really flex your creative muscles?
Sorry, it was muffled that I couldn't.
It was basically saying that time in cinema, when Scorsese and all these guys and Spielberg were really changing Hollywood, new Hollywood essentially.
Yes.
You were part of that in a sense. And did you find that, I guess I'm going to rephrase this to say, did their excitement and creativity rub off on you, or did?
Oh, very much so. It was all so natural somehow. We worked with one of them, and then they were all friends with each other. They kind of passed me around. You know,
In a good way.
I became kind of a bulletin board for a while. You know, and I was doing every big film, even though no one knew that they were big films at the time. By the time they got released, and then they went into the lexicon of history, they became big films in many ways then. But just to work with all these guys and to, whenever I'd offer an idea, it was always, they loved it, and they would run with it, and it would spill over to the other directors that were making films at the same time. So I was just running crazy. I was doing 6, 8, 10 films at a time. And
Get me Dan Perri!
It was a real heady time, and I was with all of them at parties and gatherings, and I was just part of the team.
Fabulous.
It was wonderful.
Okay.
So I know that your staff probably fluctuates according to what you're doing, and I was wondering what would be the average size of your staff, and what's the longest running employee that you have?
Good question. Most of the time over the years have had no staff. For a while, there was a time when I made this board with lines on it, and I'd write each film on with grease pencil, and it covered about 8 films. And I had another page taped to the bottom of it with 4 more films that I was going to have 12 at one time. And I did have an assistant, and I had an art assistant as well. But it got to the point where I had to either hire a designer to work with me, or I would have to turn down films, because I only wanted to do what I could do myself. And I realized that they wanted Dan Perri. They didn't want some other guy who I had hired, and I couldn't claim credit for the work that they might have done either. So I started turning films down, but I was able to capture most of them.
Can I ask you about one title sequence that I love? Another Scorsese film is New York, New York. If you've seen New York, New York, there's a really fabulous title sequence. And I remember seeing it, and I said, this looks kind of hand done in the best way, you know?
And it was that hand done. All the type was from the 40s, which is the origin of the film. And I had a typographer friend in town, Vern Simpson, who had this wonderful old type shop, and all of his type was hot metal. And he would set, a few words and things for you on occasions, but I had him set every single letter and every single word of all the main titles and all the end titles by hand. And then I assembled each title and built the whole end credit from that.
Fantastic. Now, for those of you, I'm just going to say, I'm going to get to this question, who don't know hot metal. If you don't know what that means, that was a fabulous old term, because when they would do newspaper work and printing, they would actually put the letters made out of metal into the chases backwards, that the sheet would go and take the ink off the hot metal, and then the entire chase would be melted, and it'd all be done again. And it was like, wow, this is incredible. And they had guys, typesetters, who would actually do this stuff by hand. It was absolutely incredible.
Blurred when they were setting it.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
These little things.
Well, then they developed linotypes, the sheets.
Yeah.
Okay, next question, right over here.
Hi, did you title any animated films, and can you talk about how different that was working with non-real people versus real actors?
I did one film at Disney, The Rescuers Down Under. These guys were animators, the directors of the film, and I did this really nice logo that they really liked a lot. I thought it was a good solution. And at the time, Jeffrey Katzenberg was running Disney, and so they had to go out to Katzenberg's house in the morning and show him the film. And he was on New York time because the studio was run by the New York office at that time. So they'd have to go out there at 5 in the morning and show the film to them. So they came out to the studio that day, and I went to see them. And I said, well, so what do you think? What do you think about it? And he said, well, after we showed the film, the first thing out was the titles. And he said, what do you think of the titles? And Katzenberg said, I hate it, and I never want to see it again.
Oh.
So my mouth dropped. I was so disappointed. And then they wound up using some really awful thing from the first Rescuers film for it. So that this happens occasionally. I know they're making a mistake.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I just wanted to, sorry. I just wanted to ask how much inspiration you've drawn from older films. Like I've seen older films at the festival and seen the titles and wondered how much inspiration you got from that.
Yes, inspiration from older films. Well, I'm a huge lover of movies, older films, especially I watch TCM all the time.
We don't have to force them to say.
It's part of the contract.
So I love old films. I watch them over and over sometimes, but I'm often inspired by the type that might have been used on a film or how they executed it. Like the drop shots from a different angle maybe, or there's the title departments of all these studios. But the most influential one was what I did on Star Wars, when after viewing tons of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon films that George wanted me to look at, I started looking at other films that were around, and it was all available only from the studios that were on film. So we would set up appointments. I'd go over to Warner Brothers or Columbia, and I'd view a few films, all for 35mm prints. There was no video then. And I came across a film called, what was it now? Union Pacific, thank you. And
Very good.
the railroad, the building of the railroad back in the 60s, 70s. And the opening shot was looking down these empty railroad tracks. And then from under the camera, the titles rolled down the tracks. So when I saw that, I just envisioned that in space. And this legend that George wanted to do as the opening and explaining the story to the viewers, I'd set up the type and arranged different lines and line breaks, different colors, different type styles. And that took months and months and months, and I shot tests forever, different horizons and so on, but it all came out of that shot from Union Pacific. So I wasn't a fan of old films, no, I've never ever seen it.
Wow.
Good question. Okay, so here's the thing. Dan is, avail yourself of this, because Dan's book is absolutely fantastic. And there's a lot of stories in Dan's book that he isn't going to tell you on stage today. Yeah, if you want to know what really went on backstage on some of these films, Dan is not afraid to tell you. So make sure that you get a copy of his book at the book signing. And there's also a documentary film in the works about Dan's career, which I am pleased to be a part of.
Yes.
And I heard today that I made the cut. So I was glad enough.
So far, Amy, so far.
But here's the thing that is so significant, I think, is I didn't really know what I was going to say in introducing Dan before I got to the side of the stage today. And it popped into my head because we're showing at this festival this year so many incredible films from the 70s. And I know with TCM fans, there's some of you get very argumentative about what's a classic film. And if you're showing stuff, you're showing those new films from 1975. You know, ladies and gentlemen, that was 50 years ago. Right? But then it occurred to me, like, all of those films that I saw, Dan's work was the first thing, my first experience of Star Wars was Dan's work. My first